For millions of believers, the Exodus story, as found in the Bible, is an accurate chronicle that details the release of the ancient Hebrews from years of harsh Egyptian bondage and their eventual birth as a nation called Israel. Judaism is rooted in the Exodus experience, and it forms the core of the Judeo-Christian belief.
What God demonstrated for us in the story of the Exodus was that He continues to be involved, or what Jewish philosophers call it, God showed that He is a God of history.
The biblical account of the Exodus encompasses a year of awesome miracles and disastrous plagues so devastating that the Egyptian empire was laid waste.
People robbed the pyramids. The Asiatics, the Bedouin began to enter Egypt. If three people will walk alone, they come back too. Then that's to show the disturb and the collapse of Egypt happened from the literature.
It would seem to me in these days of political correctness that anytime we want to investigate any ancient peoples, if their descendants are still with us, we should first ask them.
It's called the birth of the Jewish people. We had already been a patriarchal family. We went down to Egypt with 70 souls, but it was in Egypt that we developed into a nation.
The Jewish people have records of their history. The academic world have totally ignored that. They cannot truly get a true picture if they do not have everything to look at.
But some scholars dismiss the Exodus story as fable and ask how an event of such epic proportions could be missing from the Egyptian annals. Is it possible that those same scholars are looking in the wrong time period? What if there were ancient Egyptian records that echoed the biblical account? The saga of the Exodus really begins with a dreamer, a young Hebrew named Joseph. His tale unfolds in the 37th chapter of the book of Genesis, when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers who believe his visions of grandeur will derail their own dreams of someday becoming princes of a new nation foretold by God. Joseph is acquired by an Egyptian high priest, but later wrongfully imprisoned. 12 years pass, and Joseph is still serving time in prison when Pharaoh is troubled by a dream that no one can interpret. The king is told that the young Hebrew slave can interpret dreams.
Tzafnat Pa'aneach, which means revealer or decoder of mysteries. And that is literally thousands of years. That's what those words mean. Tzafnat comes from the root tzafun, hidden. And pa'aneach is the word which is used to decode or to bring something out from a hidden state.
Joseph is brought before Pharaoh and reveals the dreams warned of 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph boldly outlines a plan to save the nation of Egypt. Pharaoh, recognizing Joseph's wisdom, releases him from prison and bestows on him the title of Viceroy.
I mean, it's literally stated, no man shall lift up his foot, etc., without your okay. Only I in my chair above you. That's the verses themselves.
At the age of 30, Joseph is given the mantle of power and soon distinguishes himself as an intelligent and skilled administrator. Just as Joseph had predicted, the 7 years of plenty arrive, followed by 7 years of famine. Its effects are felt far beyond the borders of Egypt. 2 years after being appointed viceroy, Joseph's brothers traveled to Egypt to buy grain. Realizing that his fate was all a part of God's plan, Joseph forgives his brothers. They are reunited, and Joseph invites his entire family to join him in the land of Egypt, telling them, "God has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord over all his house, and ruler over all of Egypt." Joseph's family settles in Goshen, a region located in the rich Nile Delta. There, the families flourish, growing into the 12 tribes. The ravages of the famine are so severe that the Egyptians sell their property to the crown. Joseph develops an ancient feudal system, allowing the Egyptians to remain on their estates and their farms. As the surrounding nations come to Egypt for its abundant grains, the nation's economy is further enriched. Joseph ruled as viceroy for 80 years. His talents as an administrator, architect, and military leader had a remarkable effect on the culture of Egypt. Through his leadership, Egypt becomes a world empire. Some 25 years after Joseph's death, a new Pharaoh came to power, one who had no regard for Joseph's accomplishments. In the first chapter of the book of Exodus, we learn that the Egyptians believed that the growing Hebrew population posed a very real threat to the stability of the Egyptian empire.
It started with bepeirach. We break the single word up into two words, and peirach means a mouth that is soft. And as a result, they said, let us become wise with this people to do them evil. And so therefore they came up with a plan with his advisors, which is also in the story who his advisors were, and one of them was Bilam, the famous arch enemy of Israel, who later we hear about more in the book of Numbers. So Bilam and Paro came up with the plan that they would take the Jews and all the Egyptians out to a new place that they were going to build called Pitom and Ramses. And they were going to build storehouses and treasure houses for the Egyptian dynasty there, and they would make a ceremony for cutting the ribbon and laying the first stone, and Pharaoh was there, and he had all the Egyptian dignitaries and all the Jewish dignitaries, and they cut the ribbon and laid the first stone and put it in there, and everybody was happy and they had music playing. And the Jews were given the jobs as actual foremen. Everything went well and they actually got paid. But then Pharaoh held back the money. But they still kept working because on faith they felt that it was worth it just continuing out of respect and glory for Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh had the Egyptian workers not come to work one day. And so the Jews, naturally wanting to be industrious, they took over the jobs for the absentee workers. And then the next day when the workers didn't come, but Egyptian policemen came and said to the Jews, "You're now to do this work." And the Jews said, well, we just took over for the workers until they come back so that Pharaoh's work could continue on. Oh no, the workers are not coming back. You're the workers now.
At the time of their greatest suffering, God delivered the children of Israel by sending Moses to release them from their bondage. Though born of the priestly tribe of Levi, his arrival came at a time when the Egyptians had decreed the death of all male Hebrew children. The 3-month-old Moses had been hidden among the reeds in the Nile River and found by Pharaoh's daughter. She raised him in the very seat of power, in the palace of the king. As a young adult, Moses is forced to flee Egypt after killing an Egyptian overseer who was brutally beating a Hebrew slave. At the age of 80, Moses returns to face a new Pharaoh. He asks that the Israelites be allowed to make a 3-day journey away from Egypt where they can worship their God. The king refuses. A year of frightful, miraculous plagues strike the Egyptian populace, culminating in the 10th plague, the death of Egypt's firstborn. Finally, Pharaoh relents, allowing the Israelites to leave. A weary, defeated Egyptian populace showers the departing slaves with gold, silver, and their finest clothing. The Israelites could have marched along the coastal road known as the Way of the Philistines and arrived in the Promised Land within a short time. But they were instructed by God not to take that route because, as the original Hebrew text reads, the people would see war. Rabbinic commentators relate that what the Israelites would have seen was a massive pile of human bones. They were the remains of 30,000 men from the tribe of Ephraim who had fallen in battle only 30 years before. The men of Ephraim were fully aware of the prophecy given to their ancestor Abraham that they would one day return to their ancestral land. But they had miscalculated the number of years that were to pass before the prophecy took full effect. Thus, marching into the land of the Philistines, a battle ensued. 30,000 were slain, and their bodies piled high and left to rot in the sun. As the tribes of Israel set out on their journey from Goshen, Pharaoh changes his mind and dispatches his army to bring them back. God instructs Moses to turn the Israelites around and march them in the opposite direction, straight to the Reed Sea, thus causing Pharaoh to believe they were now confused and lost in the wilderness. As the Egyptian army follows the path through the sea, they are swept away by walls of water on either side of them. The armed might of Egypt perishes in the churning sea. This awesome event occurred on the 7th day of Israel's journey out of Egypt. Since that time, every year during Passover, Jewish families still commemorate the miracle of the splitting of the sea on the 7th day of Passover. The story of the Exodus is regarded by millions of Jewish believers as genuine. But scholars often discount it because the events are recorded in a book that is considered holy. Somehow, being a sacred text disqualifies it as history. But why? Monuments and inscriptions from other ancient cultures often tell of good fortune or of victories due to the intervention of their own gods. For example, Assyrian monarch Ashurbanipal relates how he was under attack and the gods of Assyria sent thunderbolts to destroy his enemy's camp. Even though the king ascribes his victory to his gods, no scholar doubts the account of this battle or dismisses it as a religious text. If we are to answer the riddles of the Exodus, we must establish that the Bible has merit as an historical record. Is there physical evidence that supports the text of the Bible? Today, museums worldwide display artifacts, inscriptions, and monuments that speak of key figures and events mentioned in the Bible. In the 22nd chapter of the book of Numbers, the Israelites journey to the Promised Land and travel through what is present-day Jordan. When confronted with the sight of millions of Israelites moving across his land, the Moabite king Balak hires a great sorcerer to curse Israel. He employs Balaam, son of Beor. In a night vision, God warns Balaam not to curse the people of Israel. Discovered in 1967 at Deir Allah in present-day Jordan is an ancient sanctuary with an intriguing inscription preserved in brittle lime plaster. The Aramaic text contains a prophetic warning of coming destruction at the hands of the gods. The words of warning come from Balaam, son of Beor. The book of Joshua describes the first Israelite military campaign in the land of Canaan after their 40 years in the wilderness. It was against the city of Jericho. Chapter 6 describes the miraculous fall of Jericho's walls and the destruction of the city by fire. First excavated in 1868 by Charles Warren, then in 1930 by John Garstang, and again in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon. Ms. Kenyon says the pottery doesn't support the generally accepted date of the Israelite conquest.
A little-known aspect of the excavation at Jericho is the fact that when it was first excavated back in the 1930s, they found storage bins and also storage houses overflowing with grains all over the city. And this is a very interesting thing because in antiquity, what foreign army would ever attack a city and leave all of their food supplies intact? Well, if you're the Israelites and you're commanded by Joshua to leave everything intact and not to take any of the foods or anything else, only the gold and silver, then that would explain why ancient Jericho was found in this state.
There is no disputing the fact that this ancient city shows signs of being first destroyed by an earthquake and by fire. Nearly 400 clay tablets were discovered by an Egyptian peasant woman in 1887. The tablets formed a library. It was correspondence from the 18th dynasty pharaohs. The tablets mention such ancient biblical sites as Megiddo, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ayalon, and Hatzor. These clay tablets, now known as the Amarna letters, speak of a people called Habiru, and also reference the city of Jerusalem. For years, scholars dismissed the existence of the heroic King David, but a chunk of basalt uncovered in 1993 in northern Israel offers strong evidence of his existence. Seymour Gittin at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research called the Tel Dan fragment one of the greatest finds of the 20th century. King David, who ruled for 33 years before passing the crown to his son Solomon, is referenced in this ancient text. It mentions both the king of Israel and the house of David. The idea that there never was an ancient kingdom of Israel was put to rest with the discovery of this stone slab in 1896. Some have thought that the Egyptian ruler Merneptah is the hero of the inscription, but a recent analysis suggests that the king is simply recalling the victories of his father Ramesses and his grandfather Seti. Even the designation of Israel on this monument is different than the other sites named. Found among the glyphs are determinatives. These determinatives are symbols that indicate a word category, classifying Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam as cities. But these three hash marks, or determinatives, classify a people called Israel. On the banks of the Nile, near Luxor, one can see a carved relief depicting the capture by Ramesses III of the so-called Sea Peoples. These warriors are recognized by their unique headdress, known as Peleshet. These are the Pelishtim, or Philistines of the Bible. Remarkably, archaeologist Trudy Dotan points out that without the Bible, we wouldn't have even known that there were Philistines. Returning to present-day Jordan, we find more evidence of biblical people and events. Carved on black basalt are the words of King Mesha, attributing his triumphs to his god Chemosh. The inscription relates that Mesha rebelled against the son of the Israelite king Omri. The second book of Kings in the Bible, in the 3rd chapter, also gives the same account of Mesha rebelling against Israel after the death of Omri's son, King Ahab. One intriguing segment that is often ignored on this artifact is the inscription that mentions the tribe of Gad living near Atarot. This confirms that the tribe of Gad received their inheritance on the eastern side of the Jordan River, as told in chapter 32 of the book of Numbers. In 1845, under the watchful eye of Henry Layard, workers digging near the ancient city of Kalna unearthed an obelisk from the time of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. One of the most striking features of this four-sided pillar is the relief that depicts Israelite officials offering tribute to the Assyrian king. The tribute comes from Jehu. According to the biblical account, before Shalmaneser captured the 10 northern tribes, the Israelite kings paid the Assyrians an annual tribute. In the 17th chapter of 2 Kings, we read, "Against him came Shalmaneser, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him gifts." The armies of Assyria continually troubled the divided monarchy of Israel and Judah. The book of 2 Chronicles details a campaign which saw the army of Sennacherib surrounding the walls of ancient Jerusalem, locking the inhabitants inside. The record of that campaign is preserved on the so-called Taylor Prism, an artifact acquired in 1830, and it makes direct reference to King Hezekiah of Judah, who Sennacherib says he shut up like a bird in a cage. The Bible tells us that Sennacherib's forces were wiped out by a catastrophe. Only the king survived to return home. Not surprisingly, the Assyrian monarch does not commemorate his defeat. What we see in these artifacts and others is an unbroken trail of evidence suggesting that the pivotal events and characters of the Bible not only existed, but left a trail etched across time in stone and clay. In fact, both the ancient Assyrian and Babylonian chronicles encompass 400 years of Israel's history. If we search the monumental records uncovered from the time of Ramesses the Great, we find barely a clue of anything resembling the catastrophic events of the Exodus story. Ramesses II ruled for around 65 years. The only episode that remotely resembles an Exodus was a minor slave revolt during his reign. So why do historians name Ramesses as the pharaoh of the Exodus?
A forensics team was brought in to determine why the remains of Ramesses the Great were rotting away more rapidly than the other mummies. And they took the opportunity while they were doing this work to determine what killed Ramesses the Great. He fell prey to a dental infection. So that fact, coupled with the idea that we still have his remains with us today, one has to wonder, how could he be the pharaoh of the Exodus, since that pharaoh was likely swept away in the Sea of Reeds, or, according to some sources, didn't stick around to see what his countrymen would say. He actually took off for the land of Nineveh, where he later ruled.
If the Israelites were delivered from their bondage at the time of Ramesses the Great, where is the record that describes a year of disastrous plagues? Where is the archaeological evidence? If we look elsewhere, in another time period, we might uncover historical events that parallel the dramatic events of the Exodus. Why not consult ancient Jewish sources handed down for centuries? One such source is known as Sefer HaYashar, Hebrew for the upright book. This ancient work is mentioned in the Bible, in Joshua 10:13, also 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 18. And the Jewish oral tradition draws liberally from this work.
not only can't you understand the Torah without the oral law, but you will in fact very often misinterpret the Torah without the benefit of the oral law.
The current translation can be traced back to the year 1625 when the book was first printed in Naples, Italy. The publishers claim that the source for the text came from scrolls saved from destruction by a Roman officer during the siege of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 CE. The classic commentary known as Meam Loez quotes liberally from this ancient work. In the chapters devoted to the birth of Moses, we learn of a certain advisor to Pharaoh by the name of Reuel. When the Egyptian king decides that the children of Israel might become a threat, Reuel reminds Pharaoh of all the good that the Hebrew Joseph had done for Egypt. Unhappy with this advice, the king turns to his other advisors, Balaam and Job. When Balaam tells the Pharaoh to throw the Hebrew children into the Nile, Job simply maintains a neutral position, telling Pharaoh to do what he thinks is best. Reuel realizes that he has fallen out of favor with the crown and decides it's time to leave. He immigrates to the land of Midian, where he becomes known as the high priest called Yitro, or Jethro. Years later, a full-grown Moses visits this great seer and discovers a rod planted in Jethro's garden. Moses is told that no man can pull the rod from the ground except the one who would deliver the children of Israel from bondage. Moses plucks the rod from the earth, and engraved on the rod, made of sapphire, was the Tetragrammaton, the holy, unpronounceable name of God. Also on the rod were acronyms for each of the 10 plagues of Egypt. The harsh burdens inflicted on the Hebrews began with the ascension to the throne of a king described in the book of Exodus as one who knew not Joseph. In Sefer HaYashar, we learn that the name of this pharaoh is Melul, but due to the harshness of his decrees, the Hebrews called him Meror, which denotes bitterness. This pharaoh commanded that all the Hebrew male children should be thrown into the Nile. He decreed that if any slave failed to meet their daily quota of bricks, that the overseers were to take the child of the slave and use the infant in place of bricks and mortar. What is remarkable about this ancient tyrant is that he ruled for 94 years. He is called the Pharaoh of the oppression. During the last 10 years of this pharaoh Melul, he was smitten with severe skin disorders and intestinal problems. He believed that the bathing in the blood of Hebrew infants would cure him. When Melul finally died in agony, his body was in such a state of decay that no one wanted to approach it. At his death, his oldest son Othri would have taken the throne, but according to Sefer HaYashar, he was found to be mentally incompetent, so his brother Adikam was selected to reign. This same source relates some interesting physical aspects about Adikam. The populace nicknamed him Avuz, meaning fat. He was also noted for his short stature, standing approximately 3 feet in height. Unlike his father, Adikam would rule a very short time, only 4 years. It was during the final year of his reign that the 10 plagues occurred, climaxed by the death of the firstborn. And remember, the older brother Othri was supposed to rule, but found to be incompetent. This would explain why Pharaoh Adikam survived the death of the firstborn. He would survive this tragedy, but would witness the might of his armed forces drowning in the Sea of Reeds. Though the Bible never directly states that this pharaoh perished in the sea, Sefer HaYashar relates that he was snatched from his chariot by an angel. Every student of Egyptology is familiar with Manetho's History of Egypt. Ptolemy commissioned Manetho, an Egyptian priest, to write a 30-volume reference. Although it was lost when Julius Caesar torched the Library of Alexandria, portions of Manetho's original work survive thanks to 4 other ancient historians, Josephus, Africanus, Eusebius, and Herodotus. But they only quote segments of the original. From this source, a chronology was developed that lists the first pharaoh of Egypt to the last. The record is divided into 32 time frames called dynasties. When Sir Flinders Petrie excavated the temple at Abydos at the turn of the century, this site yielded a king's list, a wall covered with cartouches from the early pharaohs of Egypt. The tablets of Abydos list the kings of Egypt from the first ruler in the first dynasty until the time of Ramesses the Great in the 19th dynasty. Apparently, it was Ramesses who commissioned this ancient roll call to honor his forerunners. Manetho's dynastic list found corroboration thanks to an ancient papyrus scroll now called the Turin Royal Canon. Written in the cursive form of hieroglyphs called hieratic, the papyrus also lists many of the pharaohs and the length of each reign. From these age-old Egyptian catalogs, we can discover an amazing parallel. We find that parallel in the ancient Jewish sources, such as Sefer HaYashar. From the Turin Papyrus, the Abydos tablets, and other sources, we find in the 6th dynasty a king known as Neferkare Pheops, or Pepi II. He ruled longer than any king in Egyptian history, an incredible 94 years. In the Jewish records, Melul, the pharaoh of the oppression, also ruled 94 years. There is a curious linguistic aspect that may also link Pharaoh Pepi II to Melul, the pharaoh of the oppression. During the time of Pepi II, the hieroglyph used for the L sound was also used for the R sound. Another name that Pepi II was known by was Meri-Re. If we interchange the R's and Meri-Re with L's, we come very close to the Hebrew name for this pharaoh, Melul. If we look closely at the biblical account of the Exodus, we see a time of great upheaval in the natural order of the world. It is an epic marked by howling storms, seismic events, and possibly volcanic activity. Surely these violent elements that accompanied the plagues visited on the nation of Egypt would have been memorialized in some fashion. Thanks to an Egyptian sage, we may just have such a record. Housed in the Museum of Leiden in the Netherlands is an ancient papyrus first unearthed near the pyramids of Saqqara in 1822.
We have a writer. His name was Epler. He was telling us that the people who had no mirror, ladies who had no mirror, they began to have a mirror now. People robbed the pyramids. The Asiatics, the Bedouin began to enter Egypt. If 3 people will walk alone, they come back 2. Then that's to show the disturb and the collapse of Egypt.
The text wasn't completely translated until years later, in 1909, by Egyptologist Sir Alan Gardner. He published his findings as The Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage. The papyrus is an exhaustive litany of woes. An Egyptian called Ipuwer mourns the fallen state of his nation and his people.
That's why a lot of people their ears perk up when they hear about the Ipuwer or Ipuwer papyrus, which describes, purportedly, the total breakdown of the society.
The most striking characteristic of this record is how the text details a chain of calamities that are strikingly similar to another series of events, the plagues of the Bible. Let's compare some of the biblical descriptions with the language of the Ipuwer papyrus.
Behold, Egypt is poured out like water. He who poured water on the ground, he has captured the strong man in misery. Forsooth, the river is blood. No fruits or herbs are found. Forsooth, grain has perished on every side. The land is in darkness. Children of princes are dashed against the walls. The offspring of nobility are laid out on high ground. The residence is overturned in a minute. Men are few. He who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. Gold, blue stone, silver, malachite, cornelian, bronze, yebet stone are all fastened to the necks of female slaves.
Remember the 6th dynasty pharaohs whose reigns match those as described in Sefer HaYashar? They were Pepi II, who ruled Egypt for 94 years, longer than any pharaoh in Egyptian history. This remarkable reign is the same as the king known in the Jewish text as Melul. After the death of Pepi II, his son Neferkare the Younger took the throne, but for only 4 years, matching the 4-year reign of Adikam, the pharaoh of the Exodus. But the similarity is even more dramatic when we discover that the 6th dynasty came to an abrupt end following the reign of these two pharaohs. Egyptologists agree on this major point, that the final days of the Old Kingdom period at the end of the 6th dynasty signaled the demise of Egypt as a world power. Even though well-known archaeologists such as Zahi Hawass do not accept the Exodus as fact, they do agree that Egypt was plunged into a time of chaos that lasted for hundreds of years following the reign of Pharaoh Pepi II and his son Neferkare the Younger.
But from the beginning of Pepi II, I believe this is the beginning of the collapse, because he ruled as a young man.
Most scholars agree that the collapse of the Old Kingdom was sudden and it was complete. Historian Paul Rothstein describes it as a time of utter chaos, riots fed by moral confusion. There was terror and famine accompanied by continual mourning for the dead. It was a society eroded by destruction. Egypt was plunged into a dark age that continued for hundreds of years. Historians are confounded by this sudden and utter decline of a world empire. Some theorize the kingdom fell due to drastic changes in climate. Others surmise that the government was weakened by internal conflicts. This dark age is also found in the biblical references to Egypt. Following the Exodus story, Egypt is not seen as a political power until the time of Israel's kings, 400 years after the Exodus. The biblical account of the Exodus offers a logical reason for the cause of Egypt's rapid decline and its exit from the world stage. A year of cataclysmic plagues, the death of the nation's firstborn, the loss of Egypt's entire labor force, the removal of their entire gold and silver reserves, and the drowning of Egypt's entire armed forces. Exciting new evidence has emerged that may provide more scientific proof of the biblical Exodus. Thanks to a technology known as satellite remote sensing, we're discovering ancient roads, structures, even entire towns buried under the earth. Recently, a team of archaeologists discovered 17 pyramids, more than 1,000 tombs, and 3,000 ancient settlements in Egypt's Nile Delta using this technology. When those same archaeologists excavated over 20 of those ancient sites, they discovered remains including pottery from the Old Kingdom time frame. Even more remarkable is the fact that no pottery from the Middle Kingdom period, a later time period, was found on any of these sites, suggesting that for some reason the people who inhabited the Nile Delta during the Old Kingdom period were forced to make a mass evacuation from the region, leaving their homes and villages never to return. Since the children of Israel settled the Nile Delta, this could be proof that they made their exodus from their homes in the Delta at the time of the fall of the Old Kingdom. Finally, if we consult the Egyptian sources, we discover another amazing parallel. The ruler found on the Egyptian king's list, who follows Neferkare the Younger, is Netekerti, the first woman pharaoh of Egypt.
The dynasty 6 ended by a reign of a lady. Her name is Netekhert, a lady that we know nothing about her. Maybe she was from the royal family. There is no more male king to be the king of Egypt, then a female began to be the king. We know in ancient Egypt that men has to rule, women cannot rule.
Is it possible that she took the throne because there was no male heir to rule? Perhaps the previous pharaoh had been lost in the splitting of the Sea of Reeds. Biblical scholar Alexander Houle has shed new light on the reality of the plagues in his book, Pharaoh, Biblical History, Egypt, and the Missing Millennium. He's also reconciled the problematic dating of the Exodus in the historical record by demonstrating that 3 different dynasties have been misdated, and that the rulers of those dynasties were very likely co-regents. That is, each ruled from a different location within the vast Egyptian empire. Using verifiable astronomical dates taken from the ancient Elephantine papyri, Houle recalibrates several ancient calendars, and in doing so, demonstrates how rulers from the end of the 6th dynasty and those from the 13th and 18th dynasties all governed during the same general time period. For example, Neferkare Pheops would have ruled from Memphis near the Delta, while Thutmose II governed from Thebes, 400 miles south of Memphis. Did Thutmose II also witness the 10 plagues? It seems that he actually experienced them, specifically the plague of boils. When the mummy of Thutmose II was discovered by Gaston Maspero in 1886, he described the preserved remains of the pharaoh as covered with scabs and scars from head to toe, scars that resemble boils. In 2007, a team of medical experts led by Egyptologist Zahi Hawass conducted CAT scans on the mummies of Queen Hatshepsut, the wife of Thutmose II, and on the queen's nanny. The skin of both mummies revealed the very same severe scarring, typical of boils. The story of the Exodus really begins with Joseph. Had this son of Jacob not been sold into slavery and eventually and improbably risen through the ranks of power to rule Egypt, there might not have been an Exodus. The last chapter of the book of Genesis relates how God used Joseph to not only save his own people, but the entire nation of Egypt. The wisdom granted Joseph allowed him to enrich the throne and to build Egypt into a world power.
We have a tradition that Joseph was taught by his father that his job would be to retrieve knowledge that had been from the Garden of Eden that had gone out and had become used for magic. And therefore he was prepared by his father before he went down to Egypt, and whatever he learned in Egypt was now reclaimed back into its original purpose, which was not for magic, but for the deep wisdom that God had given man.
At Beit Kalaf in Upper Egypt, Pharaoh Djoser's likeness appears alongside another figure called Zanach. Archaeologists tell us that no tomb has ever been found for this person, and it's been suggested that the step pyramid might have actually been intended for Zanach. Could Zanach be a linguistic corruption of Joseph's title found in Genesis 41:45, Zaphnath Paneach, the revealer of secrets? Surely his achievements must have found their way into the annals of Egypt. If, as we have shown, that the Exodus occurred at the end of the 6th dynasty, we should be able to find evidence of Joseph in one of the previous dynasties. In the 3rd dynasty, during the reign of the pharaoh known as Djoser, we find a noble figure who exhibits amazing talents. He was called Imhotep. He was a competent administrator for the crown and apparently excelled in architecture and medicine. Imhotep is best known as the designer of the famous step pyramid at Saqqara. Could this man be Joseph? 2 additional facts make Imhotep a strong contender for the biblical Joseph. Remember, Joseph saved Egypt from a famine that would last 7 years. At a site known as Sechel, near the first cataract of the Nile, inscribed on a rock is the account from the time of King Djoser. The pharaoh, deeply distressed because of a 7-year famine and a dream, seeks the counsel of the wise Imhotep. Imhotep shares another distinction with Joseph. Both men were regarded as commoners before they took the office of prime minister.
There's a very curious turn of the phrase in the book of Genesis when Joseph describes his office to his father Jacob when he asked him to come down and join him. He says, God has made me a father to Pharaoh. Well, in the Old Kingdom, the prime minister's office, the Egyptian word for that office or that title was Etif. And Etif, literally translated, means father of Pharaoh.
The Bible tells us that Joseph lived to the ripe old age of 110. Interestingly, there was a proverb passed down through the centuries among the Egyptians. It was said that to achieve perfect wisdom, one should live to the age of 110. When Joseph was 100 years of age, he was asked by younger, envious court officials to prove his worth. Joseph amazed Pharaoh and his rivals by engineering a series of canals fed by the Nile. It created an artificial body of water that would provide irrigation for the parched western desert. Today, southwest of modern Cairo sits a large freshwater lake in a natural basin surrounded by desert. The region is called the El Fayoum. The lake is fed by a large canal that has existed since the days of the pharaohs, and the canal has been called since those days Bar Yosef, or the Sea of Joseph. Joseph was prime minister for 80 years, and one of the pharaohs we believe he served was called Unas. The causeway leading to the pyramid of Unas once featured carved reliefs, now on display in the Louvre in Paris. The carvings portray a time when starving foreigners came to Egypt. It's quite possible that Unas was commemorating the very same famine described in the Bible during Joseph's time as prime minister. Within the tomb of Unas, beneath his pyramid, the walls are covered with well-preserved text that extol the virtues of the dead king and how he will serve the gods in the afterlife. On the wall of the southeast chamber is a curious inscription that is actually a prophecy. It tells of an unknown God who will kill Egypt's firstborn. This is a remarkable inscription when we consider that all of the Egyptian gods were named. But Joseph would have never uttered aloud the name of his God, the God of Israel. The inscription hints at the possibility that Pharaoh Unas was aware that one day the God of Joseph would avenge the death of the Hebrew children. It would seem that Pharaoh Unas wished to curry favor with God by inscribing in his tomb these words, "Unas will judge with him whose name is hidden in the day of the slaying of the eldest."
This time period was handed down from generation to generation, from sage to sage, where only the truth was the matter. Rigorous hours on the study of one Omid of the Talmud, one page of the Talmud, can indicate the great length that the sages took to try and discern the truth in all its glory in all fields.
Since we can demonstrate that there is a logical connection between the biblical Exodus and the end of the Old Kingdom period, we can pinpoint this pivotal event in time. But which chronology should we consult? The Egyptian dynastic chart is plagued with problems. It is an artificially constructed chronology that Egyptologists have been forced to revise and update over 20 times. In fact, 3,000 years have been trimmed from this timetable since it was first introduced. 5 Cambridge scholars have challenged the generally accepted dating system for historical Egypt and called for yet another revision. They claim that the faulty dating methods have inflated the Egyptian chronology by more than 2 centuries. And there is a collateral effect. Since all of the chronologies of the Near East are calibrated according to the Egyptian timetable, they are also inflated by almost 250 years. Why not consult the Jewish chronology called Seder HaOlam?
For me, the acid test of determining whether a scholar has really done his homework as to the question of the Exodus is to ask them how long they think that the tribes of Israel actually lived in the land of Egypt. If they say 400 years or 430, I know they haven't done any digging of any real value. Because you can ask any 9-year-old yeshiva kid, and they will tell you that his ancestors, in fact, only spent 210 years in the land of Egypt from the time that Jacob and his family arrived until they departed 210 years after arriving. So where do we get the 400 versus the 430, the 2 figures given in the Bible? Well, the first figure, 400 years, in the promise or the prophecy given to Abraham, that actually took effect with the birth of his son Isaac, because the prophecy says that this would happen to his seed, to his descendants. So the 400-year period encompasses the experiences of all of Abraham's descendants, from Isaac all the way down to Jacob, and then, of course, to the 12 tribes. The 430-year period, when it says in the book of Exodus that they marched out on that very day, 430 years later, if you count back from the day they marched out of Egypt all the way back to when that prophecy was actually given, the very day it was given to Abraham, that span of time was 430 years.
Historian Paul Rothstein reminds us that this timetable has never been changed. Other chronologies and calendars, even our own, have been subject to constant revision. But because time is sacred to the Jewish people, their scholars have kept a meticulous record of their beginnings and their entire history.
Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta made what's called the Seder Olam, which literally means the order or the chronology of the world. And for the first time then, somebody had gathered all the traditions together Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta did order that information.
This is why there has been no mistakes, no gaps. This is part and parcel of the Jewish heritage, the time, because it's our connection to Sinai. It's our connection to the creation of the world. When you keep a time span, then you are giving testimony to what was given on Mount Sinai. You're giving testimony to the beginning of creation. That's why the Jewish people have almost considered sacred the protection of world history.
Seder HaOlam counts the flow of time from the birth of Adam. For example, the year 1948 is 5708 on the Jewish calendar, or 5,708 years from Adam. The flood of Noah is dated at 1656, that is 1,656 years from Adam, and so on. And the Exodus? The year that marks the release from slavery of the Jewish people and the creation of a nation called Israel is still memorialized as the 15th day of the first month in the year 2448 from Adam.
What God demonstrated for us in the story of the Exodus was that he continues to be involved, or what Jewish philosophers call it, God showed that he is a God of history.
Any attempt to solve the riddle of the Exodus should always begin by first consulting Jewish sources, kept alive by their sages and their written sources. After all, it is the Jewish people who actually experienced this seminal event in the creation of their nation called Israel.